The sea hammers the shore like a drum of fate. Emma, an orphan with salt on her skin and courage in her bones, accepts a humble marriage to a quiet fisherman, chasing safety, not dreams. But on a storm-torn night, lanterns flare, hooves shatter the dark, and a royal carriage kneels at her door. A name she never knew she carried trembles on the brink. A husband she barely knows stands between two lives, net and signet, tide and title. One secret will unmoor them both. Duty or desire, shore or hall. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from, and what do you seek most in a period romance? Passion, peril, or the promise of home? Whitstable, Kent, the year of our Lord, 1593. The sea carried both the scent of salt and the memory of sorrow. Each morning the tide kissed the stone-streaked shore with a devotion that only the constant could understand. And it was on that shore, between the cries of gulls and the crackle of wind-blown linen, that Emma had learned what survival meant. She was 23, neither young enough to be called a girl, nor secure enough to be called a woman of means. Orphaned before she could recall the lullaby of her mother's voice, Emma had grown in the margins of Whitstable's tide. Raised by widows, fishwives, and the hush of the sea, she learned to read by candlelight and mend nets by moonrise. Her hands bore the marks of toil, but her back remained straight, her gaze ever steady. She had never owned a mirror, and yet she knew herself. There was strength in her hazel eyes, windswept color in her cheeks, and long chestnut hair she wore either in braids or bound with a strip of sailcloth. She moved with the calm assurance of one who had nothing to prove and nothing to lose. The gown she wore was a kirtle of worn wool, once blue, now the shade of a storm-drenched sky. A linen smock lay beneath, patched in places where thread was cheaper than new fabric. Her apron bore stains of ash and brine, her shoes creaked with softened leather and sea salt. And upon her chest, pinned close to her heart, was her only possession of beauty, a brooch left behind by her mother, silver, delicately forged, with a strange floral crest she had never seen elsewhere, its meaning unknown, but its presence constant. Emma touched it when she needed to remember that she came from something, even if she did not know what. When Thomas asked for her hand, it was not with poetry, nor with promises. It was in the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon, while she scrubbed fish scales from a weathered pail. "You've no one," he said plainly, "and neither do I. You need a roof. I could use a voice that isn't the sea." She had looked at him then, not for wealth, for he had none, nor for charm, for he was a man of few words. But there was kindness in the way he stood, in the way he waited for her answer, with his hands behind his back and his eyes fixed on the ground. And there was something in his silence that felt familiar. "I'll come," she replied, "if there's room for me to think." "There is," he'd answered, "and if there isn't, I'll make it." Their home was a fisherman's cottage, stone and wood, tucked behind dunes swept clean by the wind. The fire smoked in winter, the roof groaned in rain, but it was theirs. They ate together by lamplight, spoke little, and lived without pretense. He brought her dried flowers when the season allowed. She patched his shirts and sang softly when storms rattled the shutters. They had not kissed more than a few times, and never with urgency. Their intimacy lived in shared silence, in glances held too long, in the way his fingers brushed hers when passing the salt. There was no poetry spoken aloud, but it echoed in everything unspoken. Thomas was 30, sun-browned and broad of shoulder. His hair, a dark blonde faded by salt, was often damp and tied loosely at the nape. His eyes were storm grey, too intelligent for a fisherman, too quiet for a brute. He worked without complaint, slept without restlessness, and bore a scar near his left temple that he never explained. He wore no ring. But one night, as he undressed by the hearth, Emma saw a leather thong slip from beneath his shirt. Suspended from it was a signet ring, dull from years of salt air. When she asked, he only said, "Old thing, wasn't mine to begin with." And she, knowing the weight of guarded words, let it rest there. The night that changed everything came with a cruel wind and skies the color of iron. The fisherman had gone out before dawn, and by dusk word had spread through the village. A skiff had overturned near the spit. Thomas, among others, had gone into the waves to rescue the men. Hours passed. Lanterns dotted the beach like stars fallen from the heavens. Emma waited by the threshold, her apron clutched in her fists, lips moving in a prayer she had not said in years. He returned just before midnight, barely conscious, soaked to the bone, his hands bleeding. 2 men supported him, and he refused a stretcher. "Just water," he muttered, but Emma saw the tremor in his jaw, the pallor beneath the salt. She tended to him as she always did, but something was different this time. His breathing was labored, and when she pressed a cloth to his forehead, he flinched, not from pain, but from a memory. His body remained with her, but his mind had drifted somewhere far, and she feared what lay there. By morning, a stillness hung in the air, a silence that made the gulls seem distant. She had just ladled broth into a bowl when the knock came at the door. Not the knock of a neighbor. No, this was precise, practiced, intentional. She opened the door, and the world tilted. A liveried man stood on the threshold, clad in deep crimson, bearing the crest of the Queen's Court embroidered in gold. Behind him, a black carriage waited, its wheels fresh with London dust. The herald removed his cap and bowed low. "Lady Harrow," he said, voice smooth as ink, "His Grace the Earl of Wexford summons his son. My Lord Thomas Harrow is to be returned to Wexford Hall at once." Emma did not speak. Behind her, the bowl slipped from her hand and shattered on the hearth. Thomas, pale and silent, did not deny the name, and in that instant the man she had married vanished, not in flesh, but in truth. And all that remained was the sound of the wind rattling the door, as if the sea itself had come to bear witness. The carriage smelled of old velvet, damp wool, and secrets long buried. Emma sat across from Thomas in silence, her fingers curled in her lap, her brooch cold against her skin. Outside, the English countryside passed in shades of green and grey, cobwebbed trees, moors blanketed by fog, and cottages with smoking chimneys that whispered of lives simpler than the one now unravelling before her. She did not look at him. Thomas had changed, not in body, but in presence. He still wore the rough fisherman's shirt, the faded breeches, the boots caked in salt and sand. But his silence had sharpened, turned heavy with the weight of an identity no longer denied. And though the signet ring remained tucked beneath his collar, Emma felt it between them now, like a blade placed gently on the seat, waiting to be acknowledged. Hours passed. At dusk, Wexford Hall appeared beyond a rise in the land, massive, stone-hewn, austere. Its towers stretched toward a sky streaked with the last crimson of daylight. The walls bore ivy like scars, and the iron gates groaned as they opened, not in welcome, but in warning. The carriage stopped before the great entrance. Footmen in liveried coats approached wordlessly. One opened the door. Thomas stepped out first, and for a moment the chill of the air did not seem to touch him. He turned and extended his hand to Emma, his eyes unreadable. She hesitated only a moment, then took it. His fingers were warm, but her heart remained cold. They entered together. Inside, the air was perfumed with beeswax, lavender, and something older, something still, like preserved sorrow. The hall was lined with tapestries and portraits of brooding men and pale women. The floor beneath her shoes gleamed like glass. And there, at the top of the grand staircase, stood a woman in burgundy silk, framed by candlelight and calculation, Lady Beatrice Harrow. She descended slowly, her steps measured, her expression void of welcome. Her gown shimmered with gold thread, her sleeves stiff with embroidery, and her neck framed by a ruff wide enough to serve as armor. Her hair, silver blonde and intricately coiled, glistened under the candlelight. Her pale eyes, blue as winter glass, settled on Emma with a cold precision. "You've brought a wife," she said softly, not to Thomas, but to the air between them. Without announcement, without preparation, how provincial. Thomas's jaw tensed, but he did not flinch. "This is Emma," he said. "She is my wife." Lady Beatrice's gaze did not shift. "Indeed." Emma lifted her chin. Her gown, though clean, was modest, wool and linen, not silk. Her hair, though neatly braided, lacked the jeweled pins of a noblewoman. She knew she was being measured not in fabric, but in breeding, in worth. "I was not aware I required your preparation," Emma replied, her voice quiet, steady. A flicker, surprise perhaps, touched Lady Beatrice's eyes, but it vanished just as quickly. "Come," she said. "His lordship awaits." The Earl of Wexford, Thomas's father, sat in a chamber heavy with books and silence. He was a man carved by time and sorrow, his skin pale, his frame gaunt, but his presence unyielding. He did not rise when they entered. His eyes, dark and sharp, lingered on his son for a long moment before turning to Emma. "You are the wife," he said simply. "I am," Emma replied. There was no warmth in the exchange, no joy, only the bare acknowledgement of facts, now inconvenient to those who had crafted their futures with titles and legacies in mind. "You'll stay in the East Wing," the Earl instructed, "until the matter of succession is addressed." His voice was smooth, controlled. "And until her manners are corrected." Emma bowed her head, not in submission, but in strategy. That night she stood alone in a chamber large enough to swallow her old cottage whole. The bed was carved oak, the linens stiff with starch, the fireplace lit by a servant who did not meet her eyes. Her trunk had been brought up, and beside it a new gown had been laid out, deep green velvet, stiff at the bodice, with sleeves that whispered of wealth and chains. She did not touch it. Thomas came to her door, late, his knock soft. She opened it. "I never meant to lie," he said, standing just outside the threshold. "Not to you." Emma said nothing. He stepped forward, but she did not yield. "I left that life," he continued. "When the ship went down, I was given a chance to disappear. I took it. I chose the sea over titles. I chose quiet. And then I chose you." Her heart ached at the words, but her pride stood taller. "You chose silence," she replied, "even when I was beside you, even when I wore your name." Thomas's hand reached for hers, but stopped short. The space between them filled with all they could not say. "If you ask me to go," he said, voice barely above a breath, "I will." Emma looked up at him, at the man she had shared soup with, laughter with, silence with, at the man who had never once spoken a promise, but whose eyes had offered it freely, until now. "I won't ask," she said at last, "because I will not be the one who runs." And she closed the door, gently, between them. Days passed. Lady Beatrice summoned Emma each morning, like a governess training a girl for court. She spoke of posture, of diction, of which fork to use and which gesture to avoid. "Your eyes linger too long," she once said. "It makes men believe you are thinking. That is dangerous." Emma smiled at that, and lingered longer. Julian Harrow arrived on the 5th day. He was Thomas's cousin, the Earl's ward, and as she would soon learn, the favoured heir in Thomas's absence. Tall, with curling dark hair and warm brown eyes, he had the bearing of a man who knew how to charm and when to strike. He kissed Lady Beatrice's hand with calculated devotion, and greeted Emma with a bow too deep to be sincere. "So," he said, his voice honeyed and sharp, "this is the mysterious bride who stole Lord Thomas away from the world." Emma held his gaze. "No, sir. I married a fisherman." Julian's smile widened, but his eyes did not. He offered her his arm, and she did not take it. Later she would find him watching her from across rooms, at the end of corridors, near doorways, always with a smile, always with silence. The air in Wexford Hall grew colder despite the fire. One evening, as Emma passed the grand hall, she heard voices beyond the door, Julian and Beatrice speaking in whispers. "She will not last here," Lady Beatrice said. "She must not," Julian replied. Emma paused, then walked on. Her steps were slow, but her heart pounded. That night, she stood before the mirror in her borrowed gown, her mother's brooch pinned just above her heart. She stared at her reflection, not at the velvet, not at the pearl combs forced into her hair, but at the girl beneath it all. The girl who had tied nets, who had sung to herself in the dark, who had kissed her husband's fingers by firelight. And she whispered, softly but with certainty, "I will not be broken." Outside, the halls of Wexford whispered and watched. But Emma Whitstable Harrow, common-born, unloved, unwanted, stood taller than the stone walls that sought to silence her. And though no one saw it then, the fire within her had only just begun to burn. The mornings at Wexford Hall were marked not by the cry of gulls or the scent of brine, but by the cold chime of a servant's bell and the heavy weight of duty dressed in silk. Emma rose each day before the sun crested the frost-veiled hills, dressing not in the wool she had once trusted like a second skin, but in fabrics that clung to her awkwardly, velvets, damasks, and brocades too fine for her quiet movements. Lady Beatrice, ever watchful, began her instruction at the stroke of 9. She stood before Emma like a high priestess before a reluctant acolyte, her voice smooth and without warmth, her words as sharp as a drawn blade. "Posture is not a matter of preference," she intoned on the first morning, tapping the base of Emma's spine with a fan carved from mother of pearl. "It is a declaration. The nobility do not hunch, they rise." Emma straightened, not because she desired approval, but because she refused to give Beatrice the satisfaction of seeing her falter. Each lesson became a test of endurance. Emma was told how to hold a teacup without appearing provincial, how to speak with precisely measured pauses, and which colors were inappropriate for her complexion. She was warned not to look servants in the eye, not to laugh too openly, and never, under any circumstances, to contradict a titled man in public. She endured it all in silence. Only Mistress Anne Fleet, who arrived each morning with a soft knock and a tray of tea, offered her a different rhythm. Anne, small and discreet, moved through the hall like a whisper, heard only by those who listened carefully. She spoke little, but when she did, her words were steeped in kindness and unspoken knowledge. "The higher the ruff," she murmured once while pinning Emma's collar, "the more delicate the throat beneath it." It was neither jest nor warning, but something in between. The hall itself was beautiful and oppressive. Sunlight filtered through stained glass in muted colors, falling on floors so polished Emma hesitated to step forward. The walls whispered with voices long silenced. Portraits of Harrow's long dead watched her pass with narrowed eyes and powdered faces. The chandeliers hung like crowns above her head, cold and unwelcoming. The servants did not speak to her. At meals, she sat beside Thomas at the long table beneath the vaulted ceiling. Yet even in his presence, the distance stretched like a wound unhealed. He was often distracted, called away by lawyers and clerks who brought ledgers, documents, and endless pages bearing the Harrow seal. He returned late, his shoulders heavy, his hands ink-stained. When she asked about the inheritance process, he would nod and say, "Nearly settled," though his eyes held shadows. And always, Julian was present. Charming, poised, and precise, he moved through the hall as if it were a stage he had mastered long ago. He greeted Emma with gallant words and lingering looks, the kind that drew attention from every passing maid. But his smiles, though practiced, never reached his eyes, and his presence left a strange taste in the air, sweet at first, then bitter. One afternoon, as Emma passed the drawing room, she paused at the sound of hushed voices behind the doors. Julian was speaking, his tone relaxed, casual. "She's lovely in a raw sort of way," he said, "like driftwood, worn smooth by the sea, but still too coarse for the fire." A chorus of laughter followed. Emma did not wait to hear more. In the days that followed, she noticed the subtle shift in how the household viewed her. The maids hesitated when curtsying. The butler no longer addressed her as "my lady." Even Beatrice's tone, once clipped and neutral, grew colder. "She must be made to understand," Beatrice said one evening at supper, her voice carrying across the room like a dagger wrapped in silk, "that nobility is not granted by marriage. It must be earned or inherited." Thomas said nothing. He stared into his wine goblet, silent. That night Emma walked the halls alone, the candle in her hand throwing trembling shadows across the walls. She passed the old library, its doors ajar, and entered. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of old parchment and beeswax. The shelves reached the ceiling, filled with tomes whose titles she could barely read. She trailed her fingers along the spines, seeking nothing in particular, only silence. On the central desk, she found an open ledger, ink still damp on the page. Curious, she leaned closer. It was a list of fleet expenditures, cargo routes, wages, duties paid. Emma's brows furrowed. The numbers did not match. There were gaps, irregular patterns in the way certain goods were taxed and others left unrecorded. She turned the pages, more shipments with incomplete manifests, seals broken and replaced. One ship, the Lady Mercy, had sailed from France 3 times in a single month, impossible in the winter sea. She heard a footstep and turned. Mistress Anne stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "You should not be here," Anne said softly. Emma met her gaze. "Something is wrong." Anne stepped into the room, closed the door behind her. "The ledgers are kept for show," she said. "The true dealings lie elsewhere." Emma whispered, "Is Thomas involved?" Anne shook her head. "I do not believe so. But others—" Her voice faltered. "This is a house where silence is currency." Later that night, Emma lay awake in her chamber, staring at the ceiling. The fire had long since died, but her thoughts burned brightly. There were servants missing. She had seen them once, young, quiet, efficient, and then never again. A scullery maid replaced without mention, a stable boy who had vanished. No one asked questions, no one spoke their names. The next morning, while Beatrice corrected the tilt of Emma's chin, Julian entered the salon unannounced. His boots gleamed, his smile was sharper than ever. "Lady Emma," he said, bowing with dramatic flourish, "do forgive me for yesterday's absence. I was engaged with some matters of estate." Beatrice gestured toward the door, clearly annoyed. Julian ignored her. "I wonder," he said, eyes fixed on Emma, "have you walked the southern wing yet? The view of the coast is quite magnificent." "I prefer the east," Emma replied, lifting her teacup. "It reminds me of home." Julian leaned in slightly. "But this is your home now, is it not?" Emma smiled, sweet as hemlock. "I am not yet sure." He straightened, his expression unreadable, and offered a bow once more. When he left, Beatrice lowered her fan. "Be wary of Julian. He is far more dangerous when he smiles." "I know," Emma said. "Wolves often wear velvet." Beatrice blinked, surprised. That evening, Emma stood before the mirror again. She studied the woman in green velvet with the silent eyes. The brooch at her bodice caught the firelight, its delicate crest glimmering like a secret waiting to be spoken aloud. She would not allow herself to be erased. Not by titles, not by whispers, not by velvet-cloaked threats. She had entered Wexford Hall as a stranger, but she would not remain invisible. Not anymore. Beyond the door, the House of Secrets stirred in its sleep, unaware that the quietest guest had begun to awaken. The first frost of November clung to the windows of Wexford Hall like breath held too long. Outside, the earth was pale and brittle, but within, the corridors buzzed with preparations. Candles were polished, goblets arranged, tapestries beaten and rehung. A state banquet had been announced. Nobles would ride in from Kent and London, sleeves stiff with gold, voices dripping with authority. The Queen's envoys were expected. Everything had to shimmer, even if what lay beneath was rust and rot. Emma stood by the tall window in her chamber, watching the grounds below as footmen moved like ants through the frost-bitten garden. She held her hands clasped before her, resisting the instinct to rub the chill from her fingers. She no longer wore her old woolen dresses. Lady Beatrice had ensured that. Each morning brought another gown, deep crimson, heavy sapphire, emerald velvet, all cut to restrict and emphasize, to reshape Emma into someone she had not asked to become. Tonight's gown was ivory brocade, subtle, elegant, almost bridal in its severity. Its bodice hugged her ribs like a whispered warning, and the sleeves ended in stiff points at her wrists. The neckline framed her collarbones with calculated grace, and the farthingale beneath gave the illusion of effortless height and distance. Her mother's brooch was pinned to the left side of her bodice. She wore no other adornment. Mistress Anne Fleet entered the room as the bells struck 5. She carried a pair of gloves and a set of pearl drop earrings. "You'll need these," she said, setting them gently upon the table. "And patience. You'll need more of that than anything else tonight." Emma turned to her. "What do they hope to see?" Anne hesitated. "A girl who knows her place. And if I don't, then you'll be noticed even more." Emma gave a soft, bitter laugh. "I was never trained to be invisible, mistress." "No," Anne replied with the faintest smile, "but here they reward those who pretend." Downstairs, the great hall had been transformed. Hundreds of candles burned in chandeliers and sconces, casting flickering light across silver platters and cut crystal. The long table gleamed with polish and polish alone. Musicians played in the alcove, lutes, viols, and a virginal, soft enough to flatter conversation, loud enough to drown conscience. The guests arrived in waves, dukes, baronets, admirals, and minor courtiers with titles long and fortunes shallow. Every woman sparkled, every man postured, every eye sought leverage. Emma entered beside Thomas, their arms not linked, but merely brushing. His presence was solid, but distant. He had grown quieter since the last round of legal inquiries, more withdrawn each time he returned from the city. There were shadows beneath his eyes, lines deepening near his mouth, yet he still looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. Lady Beatrice made the rounds with military precision. She introduced Emma only when protocol demanded it, her voice pleasant, her smile as thin as a drawn sword. And then came Julian. He appeared through the crowd like a gust of perfume, sweet, disorienting, impossible to ignore. Dressed in peacock blue, with a ruffled collar that skimmed his jaw and a single sapphire at his throat, he bowed before Emma with theatrical reverence. "My lady," he said, his voice smooth as aged wine, "I've waited all evening to steal a dance." Before she could reply, Beatrice nodded approval. It would be expected. Emma took his hand. The music shifted into a pavan, slow and structured. Julian guided her into the center of the floor, eyes locked on hers. He was graceful, controlled, an actor in a play where she had not been given the script. "You look divine," he said softly, turning with her in perfect time. "The color of innocence suits you." Emma smiled tightly. "And you wear sin well." He chuckled, the sound low and warm. "We all play our roles, but yours is not convincing. Neither is yours." They stepped, turned, pivoted. He leaned in as they circled. "You must be careful, Emma. There are rules here you don't yet understand." "Then explain them." He twirled her, drew her close again. "I'd rather watch you learn, the hard way." Her hand tightened in his. "You speak of threats like they're compliments," she whispered. "And you wear suspicion like perfume," he replied. The dance ended. Applause fluttered like falling leaves. Julian bowed, his smile intact. Emma returned to her place at the table, her heart pounding with fury. Later that evening, as the banquet turned to speeches and brandy, Emma excused herself from the table. She walked through the gallery alone, her steps echoing against marble. The portraits on the walls stared down at her with painted indifference, centuries of harrows, all cloaked in pride. She stopped before a tapestry that had been covered during renovations. A servant had left it half-revealed. It depicted a hunt scene, the family crest embroidered in golden thread above a rearing stag. She drew closer. The floral pattern beside the crest, half-woven, almost hidden, was familiar. Her breath caught. She traced the design with her gloved fingers. It was the same flower etched into her mother's brooch. Not an exact match, but near enough to stir something deep within her. Emma returned to her room as the guests drank deeper and the music grew louder. She removed the brooch from her gown and held it to the candlelight. The silver gleamed, the delicate floral curves unmistakable. She had worn this her entire life without question, a gift from a mother she barely remembered, a trinket left behind with no explanation. But now, it glowed like a key. Anne found her there, standing before the mirror, still dressed in ivory and lost in thought. "Your hair will tangle if you don't undo it," she said gently. Emma turned. "This brooch, where have you seen this before?" Anne stepped closer. She squinted at it, then frowned. "That's not a common design." "No," Emma said. "It was my mother's." Anne reached into her bodice and withdrew a thin ribbon, tied with a small brass key. She unlocked the drawer of the dressing table, pulling out a box of sketches and keepsakes. She sorted through them carefully until she found a yellowed invitation, sealed with wax, bearing the same flower, woven into the outer edge of the Wexford crest. Emma stared. "What does it mean?" Anne looked at her a long time. "Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried," she said quietly. "And sometimes it sends reminders." Emma held the brooch tighter. Her thoughts spun with questions, but no answers came. "Did you ever love someone?" she asked suddenly, "so much you believed silence could protect them?" Anne didn't speak for a moment. "I once trusted a man who promised the world," she said. "He gave me nothing but a memory." Emma nodded. "And yet, we still believe, even in ruins." Anne touched her hand. "You are not in ruins. Not yet." Outside, frost crept along the glass. Inside, in the quiet warmth of the room, Emma held the brooch close. She was no longer just a fisherman's wife, nor merely a guest in this house of knives wrapped in velvet. There were truths buried beneath Wexford stone, and she could feel them shifting beneath her feet. She would find them, she would name them, and when she did, she would not ask permission to speak. The fire in the Earl's study had long since burned down to embers, but the air remained heavy, thick with old paper, oil, and a scent like dried lavender that seemed to cling to every spine of the books, towering along the walls. The windows were shuttered against the morning frost, and only the low golden glow of a candelabrum offered warmth to the room. Emma stood near the door, her gloved hands folded in front of her, waiting in silence. She had been summoned before breakfast without explanation. She was not frightened, not exactly, but the gravity of the Earl's presence still managed to draw something cold into her veins. She had crossed oceans of silence within this house, but this was the first time she had been asked into its very heart, alone. Earl Richard Harrow sat in his armchair, a carved relic so old it seemed to have grown from the floor itself. He wore a thick robe of black wool trimmed in sable, and his silver hair had been combed with military precision. His cane rested against the chair's arm, unused but ever present. When he lifted his gaze to Emma, it was with the full force of a man accustomed to ruling with glances rather than words. "You've been here nearly 2 months," he said without preamble, his voice gravel and command. "Yes, my lord," she replied, her tone respectful but not timid. "I've observed you." Emma inclined her head slightly. "I know." He regarded her in silence, as if waiting for a mask to slip. "You are not what I expected," he finally said. Emma's brow rose by a hair's breadth. "I doubt I'm what anyone here expected." Something in his mouth twitched, perhaps a ghost of amusement, perhaps not. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. She did. For a moment, only the fire's faint crackling filled the room. Then, in a voice measured and dry, the Earl began. "This estate, This family was built on order, discipline, and appearances. We hold lands from Devon to Dover. Our ships travel beyond France and Flanders. Our name commands respect, or at least it did. Emma said nothing, though her fingers clenched tighter in her lap. Thomas was to inherit all of it, he continued. He was raised for it, groomed for it, and then he vanished. There was no emotion in the statement, only fact. I grieved him, the Earl said after a pause. Then I buried him, not with stone, but with paperwork. Wexford needed an heir, and so the line shifted. To Julian, Emma murmured. To Julian, the Earl confirmed, his eyes narrowing. He has many strengths. He understands the market, the court, the theatre of power. But he is a serpent in velvet, and I fear he has grown too used to the scent of the throne. Emma lifted her chin. Then why keep him here? The Earl tilted his head, studying her. Because I have no proof of what I suspect. And because Beatrice, for all her sharp tongue and sour piety, believes he is the future. Emma leaned forward slightly. And Thomas. The Earl's voice dropped a note. Thomas is a good man, but the court is not kind to good men, nor to men who run. His return was unexpected, and not without consequence. He paused. Then slowly, he reached into a drawer and withdrew a folded letter. This arrived last week, he said, sliding it across the desk. Emma did not move. He opened it himself and read aloud. Concerns have been raised regarding irregularities within the Harrow fleet. Until such claims are dismissed, the matter of succession will remain under Crown consideration. He folded the paper with calm hands. If those accusations are substantiated, smuggling, false manifests, unauthorized passage of foreign goods, then the Crown has the right to seize our holdings. Emma felt her breath tighten. Do you believe it? She asked. I believe there are traitors wearing our crest, the Earl said, his voice low. I believe someone profits from silence, and I believe you may be the only one in this house who still sees clearly. The word struck her like a storm. You hardly know me, she said softly. I know enough, he replied. You watch more than you speak. You stand your ground when pushed. You ask questions no one else dares. He reached once more into the drawer. This time, he drew out a small, leather-bound book, its edges frayed, its spine cracked with age. My late wife kept records of the family, letters, histories. One of them, he opened to a folded parchment, mentions a cousin, Cecilia. She lived in the north, near the border. She vanished during a raid more than 20 years ago. Her child was never found. Emma's blood ran cold. She wore a brooch, the Earl said slowly. Described in this letter, silver, engraved with the Harrow crest, surrounded by woodland rose, the flower of her house. Emma's hand rose to her bodice, to the weight that had lived there since childhood. She gave it to me, she whispered. My mother. She said it was all she had left to give. The Earl's eyes darkened with thought, not disbelief. Many things in this house were buried, child. Secrets, names, truths. It is not impossible that you were one of them. Emma felt the tremor begin in her chest, subtle and warm, like the first hint of dawn before it breaks the sky. But if it is true, she said, then I am of this blood, he finished, not by marriage, but by birth. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion tracing the lines of his face. I have not asked for your loyalty, he said, nor do I expect your forgiveness. But if you are who I suspect, then Wexford runs in your veins whether you wish it or not. In the words settled like dust between them, then he looked at her with a gaze less sharp, less ironclad. Be careful with Julian and with Beatrice. Neither forgives the unexpected. Emma rose slowly. Her mind burned with questions, her heart with fury and wonder. Why are you telling me this? She asked. The Earl's voice was quiet now. Because you may be the last one here with the courage to do what must be done. Because I am old and tired and haunted, and because you remind me of her. He did not say whose name lingered unspoken. She left him there, among the dying embers and the scent of memories. In the corridor, The light felt different. The walls no longer pressed in so tightly. Her steps were slow but certain. She passed a mirror and stopped. In the reflection, she saw not a fisherman's bride, not an unworthy intruder, not a girl stitched into borrowed velvet. She saw a woman born of storm and silence, a woman carved from sea and blood, a woman holding a brooch that had crossed time and sorrow to reach her. She touched it gently as if it might speak, and somewhere deep within, something stirred. That night, in the West Wing, Lady Beatrice dined privately with Julian. Her lips were painted in carmine, her eyes sharp with resolve. "She's dangerous," she said between sips of wine. "She's inconvenient," Julian corrected with a smile. "Then make her disappear," Beatrice whispered. "Like all things that don't belong." And in the shadows of Wexford Hall, the knives began to sharpen behind the silken veils. The sea welcomed her back like a mother, pretending she had not wept in her absence. In the hush of night, with stars veiled behind a sky heavy with fog, Emma stepped off the carriage onto the familiar earth of Whitstable, her boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. No fanfare, no titles, just the whistle of the wind and the salt that clung to her breath like memory. Her cloak, heavy with rain, swirled around her ankles as she walked down the narrow lane toward the harbour, guided only by the dim glow of lanterns swinging on crooked posts. Each step echoed with a pulse she had not felt since she had left, something between freedom and ache. She was home, and yet nothing was the same. Not the way the cottages leaned inward, like they were listening, not the way shutters closed more quickly at her approach. Not even the way the sea moved, darker, restless, as though it too had begun to hold secrets. She had told no one she was coming. Only Anne knew. Thomas did not. Her return was not one of escape, but of resolve. She had come for the truth, not only about the shipments she now knew were being smuggled under the Harrow crest, but also about the story buried beneath her skin, stitched into the hem of her mother's brooch. The crest she wore was no longer a mystery, it was a key, and Whitstable held the lock. The lantern above the inn's door flickered low as she entered. A few heads turned, and then froze. "Emma!" gasped a woman near the hearth. Emma pulled back her hood. The room stilled. "By God!" whispered the widow Rowan, rising to her feet. "It is her." In moments, voices rose, and the room filled with faces she had once known like the lines on her own palm. Old Tobias from the docks, Lottie, who sold oysters in baskets, even young Marek, now taller, broader, but with the same sunburned cheeks. They stared at her not as one of their own, but as something changed. "My lady," someone whispered, uncertain. Emma held up her hand. "No titles," she said. "Not here." It was enough. The tension softened, replaced by cautious warmth. "I came for answers," she told them plainly. "Not for politics, not for power, just the truth." They gave her a room upstairs, the same one she had used when she was just a girl, returning from the market too late to reach the cottage. The floorboards still creaked in the same places. The quilt still smelled of salt and old roses. That night, she sat by the small round window and watched the tide rise. In the distance, ships rocked gently in the harbor, their silhouettes blurred by fog. But something was wrong. One of the vessels, larger, darker, was moored farther from shore than the others, as if waiting. The next morning, Emma walked the harbor in her plain wool cloak, her hair braided back tightly beneath her cap. No silk, no lace, only the brooch at her breast and the steel in her spine marked her apart. She asked questions with care. Had anyone seen Arthur Pell's men? What ships had come and gone since autumn? Where were the cargo ledgers kept now? Most were hesitant, some deflected. A few turned away altogether, but she was not easily dismissed. Finally, in a corner of the docks where the fog thickened like spilled ink, she found Eliza Coombs, a widow with eyes like sea glass and hands hard from gutting fish. Eliza had once been midwife to the village and gossip to all. "I don't like trouble," Eliza said, sitting on a crate and eyeing Emma with suspicion. "I'm not asking you to like it," Emma replied. "Just to tell me where it begins." Eliza glanced about, then leaned in. "They come at night, quiet. No bells, no taxis. They unload behind the Gull Rocks, just past Black Gull Cove." Emma's heart beat faster. "Who leads them?" The widow's lips pressed together. Then she whispered, "Pell's men follow another. Someone with Harrow blood." Emma closed her eyes. "Julian," Eliza nodded. "And he pays handsomely. Not with coin, no. With protection, with silence. And when silence fails..." She trailed off. Emma's throat tightened. "What happens?" Eliza looked away. "Ask the harbour master." The harbour master, Mr. Alden Rook, was a man long since bent by the weight of sea air and disappointment. He lived in a shack built into the cliffside, surrounded by nets and broken masts. His eyes were milk-white with age, but he remembered everything. He welcomed Emma with a nod, as if he had expected her all along. "I knew your mother," he said before she could speak. Emma froze. "You did. She brought you here in a storm," he murmured. "Swaddled you in blankets, weeping like a widow, though she wore no ring." Emma sat across from him, hands trembling. She called herself Cecilia. Emma's breath caught. "She told me to keep you safe, if anything happened. Gave me coin, a brooch, and a name." "What name?" she whispered. "Harrow." She could barely see through the tears that sprang to her eyes. "She was noble-born," Alden continued, "but frightened. Said they were hunting her, that the cousin she once trusted had betrayed her." Emma's fingers touched the brooch at her chest, its silver warm now against her skin. "She died not long after," Alden said softly. "Fever. I sent you to the fishwives. They raised you like their own." Emma stood in silence, the past unraveling at her feet. Later that day, she found Lila Harcourt, the seamstress who once embroidered the church vestments and mended the sails for the fleet. Lila had worked for the Harrow family in her youth and had an eye for patterns as much as for secrets. Emma handed her the brooch. Lila studied it with furrowed brow. "I stitched this pattern once," she said, "years ago, on the hem of Lady Cecilia's christening gown. She was the Earl's niece, his sister's only child." Emma's knees weakened. Lila placed the brooch back in her palm with reverence. This belonged to her line, and now it belonged to Emma. That night, Emma returned to the inn and lit every candle in her room. She laid the brooch on the table beside the crest sketch she had copied from the tapestry in Wexford Hall. The floral motif matched perfectly. The woodland rose, the intertwined leaves, the same delicate curve of silver. She was not just Emma of Whitstable. She was the daughter of Cecilia Harrow, and now she understood everything she stood to lose and everything she had already lost. But she would not run. She would not be silent. As the clock struck midnight, a knock came at her door. Marek stood there, eyes wide with fear. "They're coming," he whispered. "Men with no coats and too many questions. They're looking for anyone who's spoken to you." Emma's pulse raced. "Who sent them?" The boy looked down. "Julian Stewart, from London. Smoke on the water, secrets in the dark, and now danger at her very door." Emma closed the door, turned to the mirror, and stared at her reflection. Her mother's blood, her father's silence, her own name, yet unspoken. She would not wait for someone else to protect her. It was time to protect herself and those who had given her truth in a world built on lies. The sky above Black Gull Cove was silver and secretive, veiled in a gossamer mist that clung to the cliffs like breath held in suspense. The moon, pale and full, watched from behind thin clouds, casting a watery glow over the jagged rocks and the dark water below. The cove was quiet, save for the hush of waves brushing the shore and the wind weaving through the grass like a whispered warning. Emma stood at the edge of the bluff, cloaked in wool the color of storm clouds, her boots sinking into the damp earth. Her hair was braided tightly beneath a hood, and her breath came in quiet, measured exhales. Behind her, The Earl's loyal guards, 5 men handpicked by Lord Richard himself, waited in disciplined silence, hidden among the rocks and brush, muskets ready, torches doused. She clutched the brooch pinned to her bodice, not as decoration, but as remembrance. Tonight, she stood not only for herself, but for her mother, for truth, and for the name that had been stolen, buried, and now reclaimed. The plan was simple in structure, dangerous in execution. Eliza Coombs had spoken of the cove, the secret landings, the ships that arrived without lanterns or flags. Alden Rook, despite his years, had drawn her a map of the path smugglers used when the tide was right. Marek had risked his neck to send a message to the Earl, and Emma had returned not as a guest of Wexford Hall, but as its forgotten daughter. The tide was low, as predicted. A perfect night for illicit goods to arrive and vanish before dawn. Far below, the hush of oars broke the water. Emma tensed. A narrow skiff approached the shore, black, silent, gliding like a shadow. Within it sat 4 men, cloaked and faceless. One held a lantern, muffled with cloth. The boat slid onto the sand, another followed, then a third. Crates were lifted out, one by one, placed in a line along the rocks. They moved with practiced precision, and then hooves. From the cliff path came the sound of a horse at full gallop. Emma turned just as the rider emerged into view. Julian. He rode like a man certain of the world beneath him, dressed in midnight blue, his dark curls barely touched by the wind. He dismounted with fluid grace, his boots crunching on stone. "Move quickly," he ordered the men. "We sail again before the tide shifts. I want no delays." Emma stepped forward. "Then you'll be disappointed." Julian froze. His head turned slowly, the recognition in his eyes immediate, but there was no surprise, only annoyance. "Emma," he said with mock delight, "I had heard you were off chasing ghosts. How tragic that you've returned with nothing but mud on your hem." She descended the bluff with deliberate steps, her cloak billowing, her heart thudding like a drum within her chest. "You've poisoned this house with silence," she said, "and now I've come to make it speak." Julian's smile darkened. "Be careful, cousin," he said softly, the word laced with disdain. "You may find the family you claim is less hospitable than you dreamed." She stepped closer, her voice unwavering. "The men you paid have confessed. The ledgers you thought destroyed were preserved, and the crown will not be merciful to those who forge its seal." Julian's hand moved quickly, too quickly. A blade. She barely had time to see the glint of silver before he lunged, grabbing her wrist and twisting hard. She cried out, stumbling back, and then a blur of movement. Thomas. He descended from the opposite ridge like a wave breaking upon the shore. He tackled Julian to the ground, his fists landing hard, his voice a growl of fury and fear. Emma stepped back, hand to her ribs, breath ragged. Julian fought back with the desperation of a man who sees power slipping through his fingers. He reached for his blade again, but Thomas kicked it away. "You betrayed your own blood," Thomas spat. Julian bared his teeth. "I reclaimed what you threw away." They grappled near the cliff's edge. Emma shouted for the guards. Torches lit, feet thundered down the path, but too late. A misstep, a slick patch of moss. Julian stumbled, arms flailing, eyes wide. He fell, his body disappearing over the ledge with a sickening thud on the rocks below. Silence. Thomas stood at the edge, chest heaving, hands bloodied. Emma ran to his side. Below, Julian lay sprawled among the crates, unmoving. Alive, perhaps, but broken. The guards reached them moments later, surrounding the cove. Torches illuminated the crates, dozens of them, stamped with stolen seals, packed with silks from lions, spices, bottles of rare French brandy, and ledgers. One guard opened a journal bound in red leather, its pages covered in Arthur Pell's distinctive hand. Dates, routes, payments, bribes, and names. It was enough. Thomas turned to Emma. In the glow of firelight, his eyes met hers, not with disbelief, but awe. "You did this," he said hoarsely. "No." she replied. We did. But in her heart she knew. She had stood alone when none had dared. She had listened, questioned, searched. She had bled for the truth. She had not saved a man. She had saved a name. The guards lifted Julian's body carefully, binding his wrists despite the injuries. He would face judgment in London, and Pell would no longer hide behind gold and titles. As dawn broke over Black Gull Cove, Emma stood on the sand, her cloak torn, her fingers still aching from where Julian had twisted them. Thomas approached her in silence. His shirt was torn at the collar, his brow bruised, his mouth set in a line that trembled. He took her hand, gently, reverently. "You've changed everything," he whispered. She shook her head. "I only revealed what was always there." He looked at her. Not as the girl he had found among nets and salt, not as the stranger thrust into silks, but as a woman of fire, forged by truth. And when he leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers, neither spoke. There was no need. Around them, the sky lightened, the sea exhaled, and the name Harrow, once buried in lies, rose again, carried not by blood alone, but by courage, by her. The city of London did not sleep. It smouldered. Its streets, narrow and slick with November mist, were alive with the groaning of carts, the murmurs of watchmen, and the restless tread of lives lived in close, watchful quarters. The fog rolled in from the Thames like a living thing, curling around chimneys and lampposts, settling over the grand facades of Whitehall with the cold authority of winter. Inside the council hall of Her Majesty's Court of Trade and Estates, the air was no less suffocating. Emma stood at the center of a long stone chamber, flanked by oak columns and stained glass windows that glinted dull red and gold beneath the overcast sky. Above her, tapestries of the royal coat of arms swayed slightly in the draught. Ministers sat in high-backed chairs carved with Latin maxims, their robes embroidered with rank and suspicion. She wore no jewels, no powder, no armor, but truth. And beside her stood Thomas, his shoulders square beneath a dark blue doublet, hair tied at the nape, jaw tight. His hand brushed hers only once before they entered, just a whisper of warmth. The same hand that had held hers the night they were married in Whitstable. Now it trembled. "Lord Thomas Harrow," the Chancellor began, his voice echoing through the chamber, "you return to this court not only with the weight of a name once presumed dead, but with suspicion draped across your shoulders like a borrowed cloak. You are accused, by blood, of fraud, desertion, and participation in smuggling under Her Majesty's seal." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Among them sat minor nobles, auditors, and scribes with quills poised to record the outcome that would ripple through the ranks of England's landed power. Julian was there too. Seated at the far end of the hall, flanked by two guards, he looked like a man who had refused the taste of regret. His face was pale, a white canvas of fury barely restrained. A bandage wrapped his ribs, and his left hand was splintered, yet his posture remained proud, as if the fall had not broken his ambition. Emma looked straight at him, and for the briefest moment their eyes met. It was not hate she felt, it was something colder. The Chancellor continued, "Before us is the evidence provided by Lady Emma Harrow, born of Whitstable. She brings forth witness accounts, ledgers, and materials seized at Black Gull Cove, items bearing the signature of one Arthur Pell, merchant of ill repute. She further accuses Lord Julian Harrow of orchestrating a conspiracy to defraud the crown and displace the rightful heir." The hall went silent. The Chancellor turned to Thomas. "Do you deny the accusations against you, sir?" Thomas stepped forward. His voice was low, steady. "I do not deny that I disappeared. I do not deny that I took the name of a drowned man, nor that I left behind a title I believed no longer mine. But I swear before this council and before God that I never used my absence for crime. I lived as a fisherman. I earned every meal with my hands. I never touched contraband. I never trafficked the Queen's seal. My only crime was abandoning the name Harrow, and for that I stand ready to answer. The Chancellor nodded slowly. You speak as one who has not forgotten who he once was. Emma stepped forward then. The silence thickened. She did not flinch. My lords, she began, her voice clear, carrying across the cold stone, you see before you a man who returned not to claim power, but to protect what was being used in his name. It was not Lord Thomas who corrupted the Harrow fleet. It was those who remained behind, who wrapped themselves in silk and whispered behind closed doors, believing no one would listen. Her gaze swept across the room. I listened. She unfolded the red ledger. The pages rustled like wings. These are the accounts of Arthur Pell. Every payment, every falsified route, every stolen shipment. Witnesses from Whitstable, whose names you will hear, saw these goods offloaded at night, protected not by sailors, but by bribed officers bearing forged letters of immunity. She laid the ledger before the ministers. Julian Harrow used this fleet not for the crown, but for his own ambition. He used my husband's absence to build an empire on shadows. And when I sought the truth, he answered with threats and blades. The Chancellor raised a brow. You speak boldly, Lady Emma. I speak only what I saw. A door opened at the back of the chamber. Eliza Coombs entered, escorted by a guard. Her grey shawl was neatly folded, her eyes sharp, despite the grandeur of her surroundings. Behind her, Marek, Aldenrook, and Lila Harcourt followed. Each was called. Each gave testimony. They spoke of hidden ships, of payments made in sealed envelopes, of a brooch once worn by a noble woman who fled north, whose child carried a name lost to time. The brooch was presented next. Emma watched as it passed from gloved hand to gloved hand, no longer just a trinket, but a symbol of lineage, of blood, of something sacred and nearly erased. Julian's jaw tightened. When asked to respond, he rose slowly, his voice icy with disdain. It is convenient, is it not, he said, that my cousin returns from the dead with the perfect wife, the perfect story, and the perfect scapegoat. He turned to the ministers. You wish to believe that a fisherman and a peasant girl uncovered a plot of this scale? You dishonor your intelligence. This is not justice, it is theater. Then explain this, the Chancellor snapped, tossing a second ledger to the floor, one bearing Julian's own hand, matching seals, matching ink. Julian's eyes flickered. He said nothing. The Chancellor stood. We have heard enough. The ministers conferred in low voices, the rustle of robes, the scratching of quills, the crackling of the hearth. Then silence. The Chancellor spoke. Let it be recorded in the books of the Crown and witnessed by all present. Lord Thomas Harrow is hereby reinstated as the rightful heir to the earldom of Wexford. The charges against him are dismissed. Emma closed her eyes, breath catching. Julian's name was read next. For the crimes of conspiracy, smuggling, and endangering the stability of a noble house, Lord Julian Harrow is stripped of title and inheritance. He shall be exiled to Ireland under permanent armed supervision. He may never again set foot on English soil. The guards stepped forward. Julian did not fight, but his glare found Emma once more. This is not the end, he whispered. No, she replied quietly. It is the reckoning. Arthur Pell was sentenced to the Tower. Several minor officials who had accepted bribes were removed from their posts. Their names were blackened, their reputations shattered. The Harrow fleet was placed under direct scrutiny of the Crown. And Lady Beatrice, she did not appear in court, but the Council's decree followed swiftly. She would be sent to oversee a forgotten manor on the Welsh border, its roof leaking, its tenants few, its glory long past. A lifetime of etiquette reduced to solitude. The Council recessed. Outside, in the courtyard of the Great Hall, snow had begun to fall, lightly, softly, as if to cleanse the earth of what had been spilled. Thomas stood beside Emma, his hand finding hers again. This time, he did not let go. You saved us both, he said. No, she replied, voice barely a breath. We stood together. He looked at her. Not as a man looks at a woman who fits beside him, but as one who finally sees the fire that had always burned beneath the surface. "I don't deserve you," he murmured. Emma turned to him, eyes fierce. "Then become the man who does." And under the falling snow, amidst the echoes of justice and the whispers of legacy, their hands remained joined, not by accident nor by obligation, but by the unshakable bond born of truth hard-earned. The reckoning had passed, but its mark would remain, as would she. The morning air at Wexford Hall carried a quiet reverence, the kind that only arrived when time itself seemed to slow, as though the house knew that something sacred was about to unfold. The frost on the chapel windows had not yet melted, casting a delicate lacework of silver against the glass. Outside, the gardens slumbered beneath a soft veil of snow, untouched and solemn. Inside, the private chapel, rarely used and untouched by vanity, was bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. Emma stood at the threshold, the stone floor, worn smooth by generations of silent prayer, stretched out before her. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows, casting pale, golden lines upon the pews. Along the walls, portraits of Harrow's long buried looked down with fixed expressions, some proud, others grave, but none as alive as the man who knelt now at the altar, Thomas. He did not wear his lord's coat, nor the ceremonial vestments that the title demanded. Instead, he stood cloaked in simplicity, just a dark wool coat, his boots marked by mud from the stables, his hair loosely tied back, untouched by powder or artifice. He turned when he heard her steps and rose. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them shimmered with unspoken things, the weight of the past months, the wounds now healing, the bond reforged not by duty but by choice. "I asked you once to be my wife beneath the sky," he said at last, his voice low and thick with emotion. "And you said yes before God and wind and water, but today I ask again. Not as the heir, not as the Earl's son, just as a man." He stepped forward, reaching into his coat. From his pocket he withdrew the ring. It was the same one that had once hung from a leather cord around his neck, weathered, simple, worn smooth with time. A fisherman's ring, a promise made not in gold, but in grit. Emma looked at it and felt the breath catch in her throat. "I do not ask for ceremony," Thomas continued. "I ask for your truth, if you still have it to give." Emma reached out and took the ring, cradling it in her palm. When she lifted her eyes to his, there was no doubt in her voice. Yes. She did not say it softly. She said it with every heartbeat, with every breath she had learned to guard in Wexford Hall, with every silence she had swallowed, and every battle she had fought since that day on the shore. "Yes, I choose you. Again. Always." And when she slid the ring onto her own finger, there, beneath the light of stained glass and the silence of ancestors, Thomas's eyes filled with tears he did not hide. From the far end of the chapel, a voice broke the stillness. "I wondered," said the Earl, leaning heavily on Anne Fleet's arm, "how long you would keep us waiting." He was gaunt now, his once imposing frame thinner, his face hollowed by illness and time. But his gaze remained sharp, the voice still lined with the steel of command. Emma stepped back instinctively, uncertain, but the Earl gestured forward with a trembling hand. "No, child. Come." Anne guided him closer, and when he reached them, he looked at Thomas first, then turned his eyes to Emma. "You defended my name when I could not. You carried truth into rooms where men wore lies like medals. You spoke when others stayed silent. And now I see not just the woman my son married, but the blood that runs through her." Emma blinked, unsure she had heard him correctly. The Earl reached into his own coat. From within, he pulled a folded parchment sealed with wax. With Anne's help, he placed it in Emma's hand. "This confirms what Anne will now say aloud. That your mother, Cecilia Harrow, was my sister's child. That the brooch you wear belonged to her, that you are of Wexford, not by marriage alone, but by blood." Emma stared at the parchment, hands trembling. Anne nodded, stepping forward. "I served the Countess many years," she said softly. "I knew Cecilia from her christening to her exile. When she fled, it was to protect her child from political ruin. I knew she bore a daughter. I searched for years. But only when I saw your brooch, child, only then did I know." Emma touched the brooch now, her fingers trembling as they pressed against the cool silver. The Harrow crest, once hidden beneath time and rust, had revealed itself to her. Now it revealed her. The Earl took her hand. "You need not wear pearls or titles to be noble. You already are." Tears filled her eyes, but she held his gaze, refusing to look away. "You have a home here," he said. "Not as a guest, not as the wife of an heir, but as a Harrow." She did not speak, she could not. Her voice for once was not needed. The moment was not marked by fanfare. There was no audience beyond Anne and the flickering candles, and yet it felt as momentous as any coronation, as eternal as any oath. Later, when the Earl had been taken back to his bed, and the chapel had emptied of all but silence, Emma remained. She sat on the front pew, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the ring now circling her finger. Not gold, not grand, but full of meaning. A ring that once bound her to a man without a name, now bound her to a name with centuries behind it, and a future she was no longer afraid to claim. Thomas returned, footsteps soft against stone. He sat beside her, close but not pressing. "I never imagined," he said quietly, "that this would be our path." Emma looked over at him, her expression unreadable. "I didn't either," she replied, "but I don't regret a single stone of it." He smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "We'll build something new," he said, "not just for Wexford, but for Whitstable, for those who never had voices, for those who loved in silence." Emma turned toward him, their foreheads meeting, a breath shared, and in that chapel of shadows and light, with only stone and time to bear witness, their promise deepened, not one forged by status, but by choice. Not a title worn like a crown, but a title shared. Spring came late to the southern coast, tiptoeing in with hesitant breezes and skies the color of milk glass. But when it arrived, it did so in quiet splendor. The sea turned gentle, its waves brushing against the shore with tenderness rather than fury. The brine carried on the wind was no longer bitter, it was salt with the scent of promise. Emma stood at the edge of Whitstable's rebuilt pier, her hands folded beneath the folds of a soft blue cloak, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The structure beneath her feet no longer groaned with age. It was new timber now, sturdy and strong, smelling faintly of resin and sunlight. Ropes were coiled with care along its posts, and nets hung drying in neat lines, no longer tattered but mended with pride. She closed her eyes. She could still hear the laughter of children nearby, the kind that rose in bursts and spilled across cobblestone streets like marbles freed from a pocket. From the little schoolhouse built on the edge of the village green, a bell rang, calling fisher children and servant girls to their afternoon lessons. It was a modest building, no larger than a barn, but its windows were wide, and its walls lined with slates and chalk and dreams once unspoken. That school had been Emma's doing, not as a lady of leisure, but as a woman who remembered what it was to be overlooked, to be told that knowledge was not for her kind, to be taught to sew but not to read, to serve but never to lead. Now girls learned to sign their names beside the boys. They traced letters, not just laundry lists. They read stories of queens and sailors and clever orphans who found their way home. And Emma visited them often, not to be revered, but to remind them she had once knelt on the same stone floors, mended nets with pricked fingers, and watched the sea, wondering if it would ever carry her far enough. Behind her, the village of Whitstable had blossomed, not with grandeur, but with dignity. Stalls lined the square with fresh bread and smoked fish. The tavern had repaired its shuttered windows. Even the chapel had repainted its door in a hopeful shade of green. No one said it aloud, but many knew the quiet benefactor behind these changes was Wexford Hall. Emma had insisted on it, not as penance, but as balance. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of approaching hooves. Emma turned. A rider came down the road at a steady pace, dismounting before the tide touched the stones. Thomas. He did not wear the formal coat of the court, nor the trappings of a titled man. His boots were dusty, his coat smelling faintly of sea and smoke. He had returned from inspecting the fleet, his fleet now, though he never said it aloud. He spoke instead of repairs and hulls and winds from the south, as if nothing had changed and everything had. She smiled as he approached, a warmth blooming in her chest as it always did when she saw him like this, sun on his shoulders, salt in his hair, freedom in his step. "You're late," she teased. "I brought good news," he said, offering her his arm. The Eleanor returned with every sail intact, no damage. The crew said the wind favored them like a blessing. Emma took his arm, letting her head rest against his shoulder for a moment. "And what did you say?" "That perhaps the sea finally remembers my name." They walked along the shore in silence, the waves licking the sand at their feet. Gulls circled overhead, crying out with restless joy. Along the cliffs, wildflowers were beginning to bloom, tiny, brave bursts of yellow and white. They did not speak of court matters, of ledgers, of policies or petitions, not of titles, not of legacy. They spoke of the sea, of the wind, of the way the sky curved open above them, like a held breath. "You've done more here than most ladies of fortune ever dream," Thomas said after a while, his voice low. "You've stitched a village back together with no reward, but its smile." Emma tilted her head toward him. "I did it for them, but also for me." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "And what do you want now, Emma? What haven't you had?" She thought for a long moment. "To be still," she said. "To stop searching for a place to belong, and simply belong." He reached for her hand, drawing it to his lips. "You do." Her fingers curled into his. For a while they stood in silence, and then she said, "Do you remember the first time I asked you about that ring?" Thomas chuckled low in his throat. "I told you it wasn't worth much, just a bit of tin polish smoothed by the tide." Emma pulled her hand from his gently, revealing her left one, the signet ring of the Harrow crest now resting there, solemn and golden, set beside the modest fisherman's band. "It's worth everything now." Thomas looked at the ring, then at her, and there was a softness in his eyes that needed no words. "Julian remains in Ireland," he said after a moment. "No letters, no protest. And Beatrice? She has not been seen outside her manor in months. Her steward writes in her name now." Emma nodded, unsurprised. She built her life on control. Without it, there is nothing left. Thomas did not respond, only watched the waves. They continued walking until the pier reached its end. There the sea spread out before them like a canvas unmarked. A ship creaked softly in the harbor, sails furled, waiting for its captain. Thomas turned to her once more. "Do you regret anything, Emma?" She answered without hesitation. "No, because every wound brought me here. And here, I have you." The words lingered between them, warmer than the sun, steadier than stone. He brushed a hand along her cheek, thumb resting at the edge of her jaw. Her eyes fluttered shut, not from submission, but from peace. The promise was no longer in the ring. It was in this moment, in this silence, in the way their breaths aligned, in the way the salt clung to their skin like memory. They had built something that titles could not offer, a life chosen, a love earned. And as the tide began to rise, kissing the stones once more, Emma leaned into him and whispered, "Let's go home. Not to Wexford, not to court, but to wherever they stood, so long as it was together." The pier stood behind them, rebuilt, and before them the sea stretched wide, a path not of escape but of return, a future not of shadows but of light. The year was 1601, and England was a country changed. The Virgin Queen still reigned, though her crown had begun to weigh heavier with age. The court no longer whispered about the Harrow scandal. It had been swallowed by newer dramas, fresher betrayals, and younger noblemen vying for favor. But in Whitstable, memory lived longer than rumor, and on the cliffs where the sea met sky, stories still clung to the rocks like barnacles, unshakable and eternal. Emma Harrow stood at the edge of the pier, the same one rebuilt with her own hands and vision, now worn once more by years of use. Her skirts fluttered in the late spring breeze, and a few stubborn strands of dark gold hair escaped her braid, dancing across her cheeks. A wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders, though the sun warmed the stones beneath her feet. Behind her, a boy of 7 chased a girl of 5 across the dock, their laughter rising like birdsong. "Jonas!" she called gently. "Mind the edge, please." The boy turned and waved, his features a mirror of Thomas's, dark curls, sea-washed eyes, a steady calm even in play. Beside him, little Isabel ran with the fierce determination of her mother, her braid trailing like a pennant and her cheeks red from the salt wind. They were the children Emma once thought she would never have. They had come late, Jonas born in the quiet winter after her 31st birthday, and Isabel a surprise 2 years later, just as the fleet had returned from its longest journey yet. Each child had changed her, softened her edges, strengthened her resolve. From the foot of the pier, the harbour bell rang. She turned, and there he was, Thomas. Still tall, still sun-warmed, his hands now calloused, not from nets, but from years of ledgers, shipwright meetings, and compass charts. He no longer led the fleet, but the men still called him Capitan, and the boys still ran after him in the square, begging for stories of foreign shores. He carried a wooden box under his arm, the lid marked with a carved compass rose. A gift, she knew, for Jonas's upcoming name day. "Are they ready to sail?" she asked as he reached her. He smiled, lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "They're ready to build the ships, not just sail them." She laughed, the sound warm and low. "He still wants to be a mapmaker. He told me yesterday he'll chart every harbour from Dover to Venice." Ambitious. Thomas leaned in, kissed her cheek. Inherited. They stood for a moment watching the children. The pier behind them bustled with trade, more than ever before. The school had grown too. A second building now stood beside the first, and 3 teachers had been hired. Girls were learning mathematics, boys were reading poetry, apprenticeships had begun. The village had transformed, not into a place of nobles, but of equals. Emma had written to Parliament 3 times. She had received 1 reply, and it had been cautious, but respectful. That too was change. Far away, Julian still lived. His exile had turned to silence. Word arrived once a year, never directly from him, but through legal stewards. He lived modestly now, on a dwindling estate in Northern Ireland, without title, without servants, without kin. He had paid the price for ambition, the cost of a hollow heart. As for Lady Beatrice, no one could say. Rumours placed her in a convent near Durham. Others said she'd gone mad with solitude, pacing empty halls, muttering of betrayal. Emma no longer wasted thoughts on her. Some endings did not deserve a chapter. The Earl had died 2 years after the events at court. His final days were peaceful. He had walked the pier with Thomas once and kissed Emma's hand with reverence. He died holding the brooch that had once been mistaken for trinket, now locked in a wooden case lined with velvet. Emma's fingers brushed the signet ring on her hand. Not once in 8 years had she removed it. "I've been thinking," she said softly. Thomas looked down at her. She smiled. "That perhaps we should build a home farther inland, something with space for a garden. Jonas wants a dog." He raised a brow. "And what does Isabel want?" Emma tilted her head. "To rule the sea." He laughed, and the sound of it filled her heart. They walked back down the pier, hand in hand, the children skipping ahead. The sun lowered toward the water, casting gold across the waves. Nets were pulled in, lanterns lit. Evening prayers rang out from the chapel. A group of young girls in wool cloaks passed them on the road, books tucked under their arms. Emma watched them, her throat tightening. This was what had been saved. This was what had been built, not with inheritance or lineage, but with courage, with love. She squeezed Thomas's hand. He looked down, sensing her thought. "What is it?" She met his eyes, soft and steady. "I was just remembering that once I had nothing but a brooch and a stranger's name." He smiled. "And now?" She glanced forward, at the children, the school, the sea, the pier, the people who nodded to her in the twilight, not as a lady, but as Emma. "Now," she said, "I have everything." And they walked on, together. As the sky turned to rose, some stories stay with us, not because of crowns, scandals, or fortunes gained, but because they remind us of what truly matters: courage, truth, and love that endures beyond storms. Emma's journey began with nothing but a brooch and a borrowed name. She was dismissed, doubted, underestimated, and yet she rose. Not with vengeance, but with grace. Not by chasing power, but by choosing love, again and again. Her story teaches us that dignity does not come from birth, but from the choices we make when no one is watching. That family is not always blood. It is forged in loyalty, sacrifice, and shared dreams. That a simple woman from a quiet village can change the lives of many when she dares to believe she's worthy. If this story touched you, leave us a comment below. We'd love to know your thoughts. And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word brooch in the comments. It's our little secret to know who stayed with Emma until her very last step. If you feel moved to support the team that brings these timeless tales to life, you can send a super thanks here on YouTube with whatever amount feels right to you. Your gesture helps keep these stories alive. But if that's not possible right now, we completely understand. Simply sharing this video with someone who loves period romances is a beautiful way to help too. And don't forget, we've left other unforgettable love stories for you in the cards. Dive into another world, another heart, another era, because romance, like the sea, is endless. Thank you for being part of Emma's journey.